Good morning. It's May 8th, Parents' Day here in Seoul, and I'm Kim Dami. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour, starting with the Yoon-Kishida summit that took place in the South Korean capital. The two leaders agreed to send a group of Korean experts to inspect the radioactive Fukushima wastewater. And Japanese PM Kishida expressed his, quote, heartfelt sadness for Korean victims of Imperial Japan's wartime forced labor. And consumer prices here in the country appear to be tamed. But food prices and the cost of eating out continue to rise, including food items that used to be considered affordable. President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida sought deeper ties during their face-to-face meeting, marking the resumption of reciprocal visits, or so-called shuttle diplomacy between the two countries. For the outcome of the summit that are designed to take further steps to overcome bilateral disputes and strengthen their value-based partnership, we turn to our Oh Soo-young, who was at the press conference.
Seeking emotional reconciliation, South Korea and Japan are taking their next steps to overcome sensitive sticking points as the neighbours mend fences in the face of various geopolitical and economic challenges. At a joint press conference following their summit in Seoul, President Yoon and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Sunday announced key measures to build trust and value-based cooperation.
우리 두 정상은 한일 관계 개선이 양국 국민에게 큰 이익으로 돌아온다는 점을 확인하고 앞으로도 더 높은 차원으로 양국 관계를 발전시켜 나아가는 데 합의했습니다.
Building on their March summit in Tokyo, Yoon and Kishida reaffirmed their commitment to strengthening trilateral cooperation with Washington against growing nuclear and missile threats from North Korea. They acknowledged their ongoing efforts to bolster security cooperation, including information sharing on North Korean missiles. The leaders also recognized joint efforts to launch a new economic security dialogue, youth exchange funding, and new cultural exchanges. Lauding the progress they made in just 2 months, they pledged to expand programs and scholarships for the future generation, as well as the number of flights between the two countries. The two then touched upon sensitive matters. Yoon and Kishida agreed on a South Korean inspection into the safety of the radioactive wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant, separate from the ongoing probe under the International Atomic Energy Agency. This comes amid the South Korean public's concern over Japan's plan to release the treated wastewater into the ocean. Japanese media have reported that a Korean inspection team will head to Fukushima on May 23rd. In another move to grow their value-based relationship, the two leaders also plan to visit a memorial park in Hiroshima this month to honour Korean victims of the atomic bomb in 1945, when Yoon attends the G7 summit there later this month upon Kishida's invitation. Both leaders said they looked forward to deepening their cooperation on broader global issues at the G7 meeting. Further adding to the mood of reconciliation, Kishida expressed his heartfelt sadness for the Korean victims of Imperial Japan's forced labour, who he said had to work under strenuous conditions. He also expressed appreciation for Yoon's efforts to overcome the bilateral dispute on compensating the victims.
Despite the historical context of our countries, I consider it my responsibility to continue to cooperate with President Yoon and South Korea toward the future, following the steps of our ancestors who have overcome difficult situations.
Marking the first time in 12 years that a Japanese leader has visited Seoul for a summit, Kishida's 2-day trip has put the so-called shuttle diplomacy in full swing, reciprocating Yoon's visit to Tokyo in March.
It seems there is more shuttling to come as the South Korean president heads to Hiroshima in less than 2 weeks, where he is also expected to hold a 3-way summit with Kishida and Joe Biden. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The U.S. State Department on Sunday welcomed the ROK-Japan summit and said Washington will continue to work with its allies to advance a free and secure Indo-Pacific. According to State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller on Twitter, the U.S. appreciates the leadership of both President Yoon Suk-yeol and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida for continuing their push for better bilateral relations. The comments come as President Joe Biden, during the ROK-U.S. summit in April, praised President Yoon for his decision to improve bilateral ties with Tokyo. As we have seen, the Japanese Prime Minister's first day here in Seoul mainly focused on the summit with President Yoon Suk-yeol. Let's take a closer look at what the two leaders have come to agree on with Professor Kim Mi-kyung from Bukyong National University. Welcome back to the program, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good morning. First off, Professor, what did you think of the Yoon-Kishida summit in general? Did you think the summit turned out as you thought it would?
Yeah, I think it was very good. The atmosphere was personable and amicable, and the two leaders seemed to be on very good terms, supportive of each other. And also they all seemed like important bilateral issues were on table as well. So, I like to think that the two leaders are heading off to a very positive and mutually supportive direction. And another thing was that it was great to see our president engaging with South Korean press corps. It has been a while since, the people of South Korea heard him talking about substantive issues in a good while. Of course, in the company of Japanese Prime Minister Kishida and Japanese press corps.
Right. And also many agreements coming out just one day. Yoon and Kishida agreed to jointly visit a monument for Korean victims of the atomic bomb when the South Korean leader visits Hiroshima to attend the G summit later this month. First, Professor Kim, as a person who spent years in that city, how significant is that monument?
The monument is significant in many ways. The monument was completed initially in 1970, and it took about 29 years, about 30 years for the monument to be relocated within the premise of Hiroshima Peace Park. And the monument is dedicated to about 50,000 Korean victims of atomic bombing, which took place on August 6th of 1945. And when we look at the historical context, their deaths were very tragic because they lost, their country to Japanese colonialists, and then most of them were forced laborers in order to support Japan's war making when the bombing took place at the hands of the U.S. So, the monument is to commemorate the souls of the deceased Korean victims who were caught in the middle of multiple tragedies in their lives. So it is historically significant, and it is meaningful that both leaders of South Korea and Japan are going to pay tribute to the monument.
Right. You just briefly touched upon it. The monument itself holds a very deep meaning, history, and also significance. Then what makes their joint visit so notable? I mean, President Yoon Suk-yeol could visit by himself, but Prime Minister Kishida is joining him. So what makes the joint visit so notable then?
Prime Minister Kishida is from Hiroshima. He is a third-generation politician from the region. So, it is serendipitous for Japan to host G7 meeting in his hometown, where he can send out messages to his own constituents locally, and also he can send out message to the international community that Japan still deeply cares about its identity as a peace-loving country in the international community. But by having both leaders paying tribute to the deceased victims of Korean origin, that means both of them acknowledge the significance of historical events that still linger on in both societies, where Koreans in general seem to care deeply about what has happened many years ago, and they still see the salience of continuous historical significance, by watching both leaders trying to remember and paying tribute to the victims. So in a way, it is a good opportunity for President Yoon, who has been drawing criticisms from his opponents, who argue that his sense of historical sensitivity probably is lacking by trying to mend fences with Japan with stronger emphasis on economic benefits and security alliance.
Indeed. And another outcome of the Yoon-Kishida summit talks was that the two leaders agreed to send a group of South Korean experts to Japan to inspect the planned release of radioactive water from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Professor, how should we interpret this outcome?
We kind of know what the outcome is going to be. That is, the release of treated contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean is going to be okay and safe, and that's already endorsed by IAEA. And having joint investigation of the site, I think has more symbolic meaning than actual and empirical substance. That is, Japan cares about the public sentiment about this release of contaminated but treated water, and Korea happens to be the most adjacent country to Japan. So Japan is trying to make a friendly gesture in order to reassure the Korean public that it is going to be okay. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that the reports and investigations released and done by IAEA and another round of investigation to be conducted by joint investigation team between Korea and Japan are not going to 100% reassure the Korean public of its safety. Why? Because we have historical precedents where the experts repeatedly reminded the public that certain pollutants, such as asbestos, for example, was safe at that time with the scientific knowledge of that time period, turned out to be toxic.
Right.
And also tobacco smoking as well.
Right.
That was regarded as something fashionable and fancy, but later on we realized that tobacco smoking can cause cancer, and something like this can happen with Japan's plan to release the contaminated water in the Pacific Ocean, because we cannot know at the moment what kind of health hazard it can cause later on.
Right. And let's see how much information and data will be released from the expert trip later this month. Professor, thank you so much for your insight to this morning.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
You too.
The inflation rate for consumer prices in South Korea dropped to 3.7% in April. But food prices see large hikes, particularly for dining out and processed foods. Our Kim Hyun-sung has the details.
Inflation has slowed recently, but food prices are still climbing, putting a strain on consumers' wallets. According to Statistics Korea on Monday, the inflation rate for consumer prices dropped to 3.7% last month, falling below 4% for the first time in more than a year. But the cost of dining out has increased by a massive 7.6% in April, compared to a year earlier. That's more than double the overall rate, putting the gap between the inflation of dining out costs and the average inflation rate at its widest level in 31 years. Processed foods also saw a high inflation rate of almost 8%. Nearly 30% of food items saw an inflation rate of above 10% last month. Prices for jams and dressings have skyrocketed by more than 30%, while some food items such as cheese, pasta noodles, and fish cakes have seen price increases of more than 20% from the previous year. These price hikes for essential goods and services are hitting the wallets of consumers who are already struggling in a tough economic climate. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Viewership ratings released on Sunday show that over 18 million people in the UK watched the coronation ceremony of King Charles III. But apparently, those numbers are far smaller than the number of people who tuned in to watch Queen Elizabeth II's funeral. Lee Seung-ja reports.
You might expect a historic event like the coronation of King Charles III to be a huge draw for people in the UK tuning in on TV. But how many switched on to watch? According to audience measurement group Barb on Sunday, the King's coronation was watched by an average of 18.8 million viewers across 11 channels and services. With the broadcast of the ceremony itself taking place from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. local time, viewership peaked just after midday, with 20.4 million viewers when King Charles III was officially crowned. With visible anti-monarchy protests coinciding with the ceremony, it appears public sentiment toward the royal family is changing. King Charles III's coronation was watched by significantly fewer people than Queen Elizabeth II's funeral, which garnered some 26.5 million viewers. Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 is believed to have been watched by millions, but no reliable figures are available. Although surveys by BBC at the time estimated that over 20 million people had watched the event. Also, some British channels even opted to not air the event. For instance, Channel 4 decided to show Johnny English Strikes Again with an average of 138,000 people preferring to watch the film rather than the coronation. Channel 5 meanwhile decided to entertain kids with The Adventures of Paddington Bear and SpongeBob SquarePants. Still, many across the UK celebrated King Charles III's coronation with a so-called big lunch, which brought neighbors and communities together to share friendship, food, and fun. In fact, 50,000 venues held such an event, with UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak hosting a big lunch at 10 Downing Street. US First Lady Joe Biden, along with her granddaughter, attended the event hosted by the Prime Minister, with Ukrainian refugees, youth group members, and community volunteers also invited. A coronation concert was also held at 8 p.m. on the East Lawn of Windsor Castle, with names like Take That, Katy Perry, Lionel Richie, and Andrea Bocelli performing. Lee Seung-ja, Arirang News.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin in Ukraine, where Russia's Wagner group has said it would keep fighting to capture the city of Bakhmut. The group had previously said it would pull out of the city, but appears to have changed its decision. This, according to a new audio message by head of the paramilitary organization, Yevgeny Prigozhin. In it, he said Russia's military leadership promised Wagner on Sunday that it would send as many weapons as needed to capture the city in eastern Ukraine. The audio clip comes a day after Prigozhin claimed in another message that his forces have captured 95% of Bakhmut. Prigozhin criticized the Russian military's top brass in a video message on Friday. Standing in front of dozens of dead soldiers, he said that tens of thousands of Russian troop casualties were due to a lack of ammunition support from Moscow, and threatened to pull his forces from the region by May 10th. Now, Syria has been readmitted into the Arab League 12 years after its membership was revoked. At the organization's headquarters in Cairo on Sunday local time, foreign ministers voted for Syria's return to the body. Syria was thrown out in 2011 after its brutal suppression of protests against President Bashir al-Assad, which led to an ongoing civil war and a refugee and drug smuggling crisis. The reinstatement has been criticized by the US and the UK, but the Arab League has defended its move, saying that it aims to end Syria's civil war using a special committee. Consisting of 22 member states, the goal of the Arab League is to integrate members economically and solve conflicts among members without foreign assistance. Moving over to the U.S. state of Texas, a driver has been arrested after an SUV plowed into a crowd of people, killing 7. The incident occurred near the border town of Brownsville on Sunday local time. Video from the scene shows the driver ran through a traffic light and struck the crowd waiting outside a bus stop outside a migrant shelter. Some pedestrians walking by were also hit. Reports say 10 others were wounded. Most of the victims were Venezuelan men waiting outside the shelter. The driver was apprehended by witnesses while attempting to flee and is now in police custody. Authorities are investigating whether the crash was done intentionally.
Good morning. After some rough weather we had over the Children's Day weekend, we should have pleasant Parents' Day weather today. Breezy morning temperatures will jump to the 20s with sunshine all day long. In fact, sunlight might be too strong by the time you head out for lunch, so sunblock and sunglasses are a must this afternoon. Very nice weather today with even air quality forecast to be good to normal nationwide. Top readings will be 3 to 7 degrees higher in most areas. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. Thanks for watching.